First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay their respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the links between the way successive governments have mistreated our first Australians and the way that successive Australian governments have treated our most recent arrivals, especially those who sought our safety and protection by boats. So my name's Mark Goodcamp. I am one of the co-founders of the Refugee Action Coalition with a couple of others in the room, including Ian over there at the table. And we're very, very pleased and proud to be able to present this hybrid event today, and welcome to everybody on Zoom. We're particularly honoured to have with us, Daki Haidari, who will speak first, and I'll introduce him properly in a moment. And of course, Beirus Bashani, who needs no introduction, but I still will later anyway. So our forum comes at a time less than 2 weeks, before the election. We thought that refugees wasn't really going to figure highly in the election. And in fact, a few weeks ago, the Liberal Party did a couple of things, like release everybody from the Park Hotel and talk about the New Zealand deal, which I'm sure Beirus has plenty to talk about. And a lot of people responded by saying, they're just doing this before the election, which in a way we should take heart from, because for 20 years we've been told that only the most harsh policies are going to be election winners. And here you had the Liberal Party worried about their inner city seats, trying to clear some of these problems away with the New Zealand deal and the release. However, unfortunately, all the rhetoric about boats and offshore processing has come back with a vengeance, and predictably, and the Labor Party has echoed much of that. Even last night on the so-called leaders' debates, one of Scott Morrison's points was to say to Albo, how can people trust you when 5 years ago you opposed, or 7 years ago, sorry, you opposed boat turnbacks, but now you support them? And what does Albo have to say to that? So we've got some amazing voices tonight to talk to us. But first of all, I'd really like to, we're going to be welcomed by the General Secretary of the Teachers Federation, Maxine Sharkey. And I want to acknowledge really that since RAC started in the year 2000, the Teachers Federation has opened its doors to us, and we've had meeting spaces here for forums such as this, as well as our smaller weekly organising meetings. And, strategically, we see the unions as very important in terms of building the campaign and also trying to break the Labor Party from the positions that they have. And so Maxine, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Mark. I too will acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people here tonight. And it's unfortunate that we have a federal government that won't recognise our First Nations people in the Constitution. There is an election coming up in 2 weeks' time, and those who can vote, please vote. And think of all people, First Nation people around the world, and all displaced persons, and all people seeking refuge and asylum when you participate in that election ballot. I would like to acknowledge those who have struggled to be here tonight, and let you know that the Teachers Federation walks beside you in that struggle as best we can. We stand aside and allow people with the lived experience to take a lead in activism, but where we can, we are happy to support you. I was honoured to be asked by Mark on Saturday just to come and say hi to you. We need all types of activism to right a wrong and an injustice that has been perpetually with us since Australia was first invaded. We have been an unjust and unfair society, and we need people from or as many people as possible in as many ways as possible to fight for justice for all. I don't want to take up your time. You have some fantastic speakers and you have really important issues to deal with. I just wanted to let you know that Federation is more than happy to continue to support with in kind with providing space for you to continue to meet, and may you continue to grow. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maxine. And I should also acknowledge, World Refugee Day rallies, Palm Sunday rallies, we can also always count on the Teachers Federation's, endorsement for those things.
Go on dog sitting.
Yeah, that's okay. And of course, the Teachers Federation's been engaged in a very important struggle for our wages and conditions, and Maxine's been incredibly busy as the General Secretary, and could be the one if they take illegal action against us who ends up in jail. So we'll be rallying to her support if that was the case. How this is going to run tonight, I was going to call Daki Haidari first, and then Behrouz, and then Tilly for around 10 to 15 minutes each. Then we'll have around half an hour to 40 minutes for contributions, questions, and then at the end, around 5 minutes each for each of our speakers to wind up. So the first speaker I want to introduce is Daki Haidari. He's from Afghanistan. He's currently on a temporary protection visa, which, as we know, puts great limits on your ability to participate in Australian society or to reunite with your family. I've known Zaki a little bit over the years, but I really got to know him since February this year. Got much better when he organised an amazing event in Canberra. He and some other Afghan community organisers had people from all around Australia, around 3,000, I don't know if that's accurate, converged on Canberra, and I was going around the crowd saying, are you from Sydney? And the number of people who said, no, I'm from Adelaide, no, I'm from Brisbane, who had travelled. It wasn't just the Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, it was from all around Australia. And they had to compete with the so-called freedom marchers who were there, the anti-vax people on the same day, but 3,000 of them made a huge, impact on that day. He also works with the Jesuit Refugee Service that supports asylum seekers. And as recently as Saturday, he was a speaker at the Wentworth Candidates Forum on Refugees, which of course is a very marginal seat. And so we're very, very proud and happy to have Zaki here today. And he's also got some slides that he's going to go through.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thank you for being here and watching us online. I also would like to acknowledge the various land that we are meeting on tonight, and also would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Thanks again for having me. My name is Daki Haidari. I'm on a SHEV visa, Safe Haven Enterprise visa, and I have been living in Australia for the past almost 10 years, apart from my family, with no certain future, in very unstable condition, similarly to thousands of refugees that are living here in Australia. These are your friends, neighbors, your colleagues, and your housemates. It's a privilege for me to be here tonight to present. I would like to take the topic away from refugees for 1 second. I would like to talk about hope and power, because these two words are very strong, and I live by them, and I live by them every day. As a human, we all live by hope. It could be your hope for the day. For a lot of families or parents, a hope is to just go home at night, see their parents, see their kids, or to catch up with a friend that they haven't seen for a while. And for someone, hope could be a dream. To buy a house, to get married, to move overseas, or just to live like a normal human being. That's a dream for every human being. And then power. Power is powerful by itself, and it has been used in different contexts. It made so many people powerless in Australia, but it made so many people so powerful that they have control over lives of thousands of people. The power that they have and the way they use it is just inhuman. But also, as an individual, we all hold power, and it depends how we use it. We all heard these words: vulnerable, marginalization, dehumanization, poverty. Unfortunately, these all words has been used in a way to describe refugees by politicians. They put people in a very vulnerable situation, marginalize them, especially the boat arrivals, by the way they arrived in this country, by their ethnic group, by their faith, the region that they are coming in, and dehumanize refugees in so many ways just to gain power and stay in power. In many cases, they put people into very poverty. For example, when we were released from detention center back in 2013, refugees weren't allowed to work for 3 years. They didn't have work rights to work for 3 years. And I think here, I don't really know how to describe this when it comes to refugees, but I think the way I can explain is the system and the refugee policies have been big and grown so much that refugees and people seeking asylum are very tiny dots towards them. And we cannot control, and even we cannot stand against the power, which is the system and politician in Australia, because they dehumanize refugees into very small piece of the society that has taken all the power and hope from people for the past 10 years. I'll just give you a brief timeline about the refugee policies for the past at least 10 years. Beginning from 2012, this message looks very familiar for a lot of people, which said you wouldn't be settled in Australia. This was a big campaign running by a politician to dehumanize refugees and to gain power. The messaging was very broadly, not welcome is not the right word to use, but for refugees, it was very scary. So it was, you're not welcome in Australia. We were labeled as the boat people. We were labeled as illegal Muslims. We were put into detention centers, and we still have brothers and sisters that are detained till now, 10 years on. So this all has taken people's identity away from them. You know, refugees are not human anymore because they got labeled by all these other words. 2013, they were releasing refugees into community with no work rights, no access to formal education, put people into very vulnerable poverty that we didn't have the control of our lives. 2014, the turnback policy came, where they sent refugees back. Whoever tried to come to Australia, they put them into those small, tiny orange boats and send them back to Indonesia. That's why refugees are not coming here anymore, because they're not welcomed, but they are sent back to Jakarta or to Indonesia. 2015, the situation got worse. A lot of people lost their life because the asylum seekers were tired of being in a very uncertain situation with no work right, no access to education, but in a very vulnerable situation in the community. So people started taking their lives. And a lot of people from the Hazara community ended their lives. So then the government was rushing to find a solution, which they introduced TPV and SHEV, which is a temporary visa, allows refugees to stay in Australia for 3 or 5 years. At the end of that cycle, you have to reapply, reprove that you're a refugee, prove that you cannot go back to your country, even if you're from Afghanistan. You will be getting a new temporary visa. 2016 onward, people with temporary visas could go and see their families, but in a transit country. For example, refugees from Afghanistan would allow to go to Pakistan to meet their families. So that gave people a bit of hope to move forward. And then to 2018 and 19, and then pandemic came, nobody could leave. But from 2017 onward, the situation is still dire. During pandemic, no one could travel to see their families anymore. And, a lot of people ended their lives. These harsh policies and very permanent temporary lives put refugees into very dire situation. Just from the Hazara community, there's about 5,000 refugees. And we lost over 15 people, including some of my friends that I knew them. The first picture is Khudayar Amini, who put himself, who lied himself alive, put himself on fire, calling his legal supporter or lawyer, saying, it's enough for me. I escaped Afghanistan because I was persecuted of being Hazara. I ran to find a human place where I can live as a human. Got into Australia after a very hard journey, and I don't still have that humanity here. I don't find humanity in the world. It's dead. And therefore, I'm not going to live anymore. He ended his life. Hadi Safari, the second picture, the guy who came with me on the same boat last year in August, has taken his life, saying he can't live temporary forever. So these are, again, the words that we have been described or introduced to the community. We have been marginalized, demonized, weaponized by politicians to gain power. And power is powerful because we all hold power. And you're here today. Every individual holds the power. And we are in a very critical time. You can use your power in this upcoming election to make a change to lives of thousands of refugees who have been living in Australia for the past 10 years. We all have power, different power. In this election, what I'm asking is you to use your power and your friends' power, people that you know, tell them how much damage the system and politics has done to people, to myself. Because it's your power that gives hope to thousands of refugees that are living here in Australia, in your country, in our society, because we do not want to see more deaths here in Australia. These people really do need a hope to move forward. They have been hopeless for the past 10 years. The only hope for us and for thousands of refugees are to have a permanent home, a safe permanent home, and to be reunited with our families. That's all I'm asking from you tonight, who are watching me online, to use your power to give hope to thousands of refugees. And with that, that's all from me. And thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we'll have a Q&A at the end, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Daki. It's very inspiring to hear your words. And he mentioned the SHEV visa, and I don't know if people saw the 7:30 report a month ago. They did a story about some people on the SHEV. It was basically a joke, this visa. It was a brain fart by Clyde Palmer, you know, to basically do a deal. Clive Palmer, who of course is still with us in the form of United Australia Party, saying that people could have a path to permanency if they lived in the regions for 3.5 of the 5 years. But they said out of 13,000 applicants, there's only one person who's made it onto a permanent skilled visa pathway as a result. So that's another reason why we have to get rid of not just the TPV, you know, but the SHEV. Zaki's also been quite modest because I know he played a bit of a role through the Action to Afghanistan group. You know, even against this rotten government, 16,000 extra Afghan places over the next 4 years. Of course, you know, that only didn't even fully reverse the cut that Morrison made in 2020 in the budget of cut of 5,000 intake every year. However, it is an achievement, definitely, from that group of people. So moving on to our next speaker, who, as I said, doesn't really need an introduction, Beirus Bashani. You know, a legend in his own right now as a journalist, regularly writing columns for The Guardian and other publications while he was still on Manus Island. Of course, making a film, Chalker, Please Tell Us the Time, that featured here at the Sydney Film Festival. Writing a book via mobile phone to his translator, Omid, and others. No Friend But the Mountains, this book, which I highly recommend for anyone. Over the weekend, I started rereading some of it again. And I just read on his Facebook page yesterday that now there's a documentary that's being made about him that's going to have its world premiere in Christchurch on the 11th of June. And I guess we want to make sure that gets brought to Australia, that film, just as we're going to continue to fight to bring every refugee still caught up in the offshore regime allowed to come to Australia permanently. So I'm sure you're wanting to hear from Behrouz and not from me. So take it over, Behrouz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. And thank you for coming today. And thank you, Zaki, for talking about refugees who are in the community, and especially with Hazara people, that they actually, their Hazara history is very similar to Kurdistan history, to Kurdish people. That these two nations, two community and ethnic minority have been facing genocide and colonialization for many decades. So I think that is very important, because over the past 8 years or 10 years, most of people talk about refugees in Manus Island and Nauru and in the detention. And I think that's why the media really didn't raise this issue with the refugees who are in the community. And we know that 30,000 people are in the community and they have been under torture. And I think for people who are in touch with refugees in the community, they know better that how this system always chased them. You know, they are free, but the system tortured them. And sometimes that torture is just by sending a letter, a simple letter, that we are going to deport you, or they remind people that you never ever get permanent visa or live in Australia. And sometimes it's with just a letter. But I think, and many people have been killed by the system. And that is really an important issue that we think about those people who are in the community, who have been living in undecided situation for a decade. Zaki started with 2012, but I would like to go back to 2001 on the Tampa ship affair on 2001, in the day that John Howard stand up in the parliament and he said that we decide to come to this country. And I think that was a political shift in Australia. And that decision and that shift actually has impact on politics and political culture in Australia for more than 2 decades and still continues. And if we look at the election over the past 2 decades since Tampa, we see that always 2 months before the election, a month before the election, they do something on the refugees. And they politicize this issue, this human rights issue, and they use refugees for their political aim. That I think the highlight is to 2013, when Kevin Rudd announced 19 July policy. And so it still continues. Refugees always have been a part of the politics and the election campaigns. And especially on 2019, I remember on that time I was in Manus Island, and they established a campaign on refugees again. And I remember how they did some really unhuman stories on Daily Telegraph and those newspapers against some individuals in Manus Island. And they established that campaign again, and the Prime Minister Morrison, he went to Christmas Island, and he looked at the beach, looked at the sea, and said that I am someone who will stop the boats. But on that time, I remember that refugees were really worried. And then the mosque attack happened in New Zealand. Then they shifted the campaign to something else, and they stopped talking about refugees. But this time, I think it's for the first time that refugees are not really a part of the main part of the campaign. And I think we should be happy about that, because anytime when refugees, they raise this issue in the election, in the campaigns, I think they are able to use refugees very easily to scare people and get their votes. But this time, of course, sometimes they talk about refugees, but it's not a big, and I think that shows a political shift in Australia. That shows that people of Australia don't tolerate this kind of policy anymore. They have questions about this, how they have destroyed people, destroyed families, and violate human rights, and also a very expensive policy with a high corruption. They spend more than $14 billion on this policy. And that's why I think people cannot tolerate this anymore. That's why they released refugees in Park Hotel, because I think they were sure that if they keep them there, it's going to be bad for them. That's why. So that was, again, a political decision. But generally, I think now that we are less than 2 weeks to the election, I think we should think about those people, especially who are in Port Moresby. 100 people are in Port Moresby, about 80 people are in Nauru, and still they are waiting. You know, I'm in touch with some of them, and the situation is really difficult. They are forgotten. No one talk about them anymore like before. And especially with this, you know, the deal with New Zealand, that they accepted the agreement, the offer, I think that is going to be more difficult for them, because the refugees in Port Moresby until now are not a part of this deal, this agreement. So we had an event last week in the parliament in New Zealand. So we raised the issue, and we will continue that New Zealand government include those people in Port Moresby as well. But I think it will be a long process, and those people have been there for almost a decade. And in Australia, these 30,000 people who have been separated with their families, who have been living under this situation, I think it is really a time that I know that people are active, but remember the election on 2019, most of people thought that Labour will win, and it will be something change, at least for refugees who are living in limbo, but that didn't happen. And I never ever forget that day in Manus Island, in the day of the election. That was really a dark day, the dark night for refugees. I myself, that in Manus Island, I myself, probably for the first time, I lost hope when the Liberal won the election. And I was thinking that these people cannot stay in this situation for another 3 years. And all of these elections, you know, that we have experienced, first with Tony Abbott, first was Kevin Rudd, then Tony Abbott, then Malcolm Turnbull, then Morrison. So, you know, we've seen many prime ministers, you know, and I think this time people should really get more active, and we should put the power and all energy on this campaign to create some political change. Really, refugees are among the most marginalized people in the society. And the most interesting thing is that refugees' lives get affected by politics more than anyone. And they don't have a vote right. They cannot vote, but their lives is really related to the election. So this time, I think it's really important that we don't forget the election on 2019, that we thought that is going to be a political change. But again, you know, these horrible politicians, they got power, you know. And I think now that I'm talking with you, you know better than me, but it's better that we say it again, that thousands and thousands of people who are counting days to this election, they are expecting to see some change, you know. And I think this time is really, it's the time that people of Australia do something, you know, for human rights. Because I should mention just one thing, and then I end my speech, that this policy, people think that people who are fighting against this system, they are fighting for refugees. You are not only fighting for refugees, you are fighting for your society, the values that you believe, for democracy, because this policy has negatively impacted on political culture in Australia. We see that how they are running the country. So I think we should get active. You know, if we just vote by ourselves is not enough. We should do something, get active until the last day to affect on the election. This election probably is very close, and that's why needs to a real fight, you know, and we should be practical, not just talking. And I think, so I'm in New Zealand, but I am doing my best from here, but I don't think that I have a big role as a person, but you are there and just try to be more practical. Yeah, thank you. I cannot hear you.
Thank you very, very much, Behrouz. And, you know, you may be across the Tasman Sea, but your voice is incredibly powerful and incredibly poignant for everybody. From all those articles that you wrote condemning the bipartisan policy and continuing that now from where you are in New Zealand. And I really hope that it's not to, if there is a change of government and a change of policy to some extent that we can push, that it's not too long before we can fly you over here and have you here in person speaking to an event much, much, much bigger than this as part of the fight for the genuine policy change, you know, that we need. Our next speaker is Matilda Faith, who's an activist with the Refugee Action Coalition and works at the University of Technology, Sydney, and has been involved with RAC for quite a few years now and has often spoken at rallies as well. As you know, I mean, Behrouz talked about 2001. We existed in around 2000 when in the lead up to the Sydney Olympic Games, and we obviously did some actions, but that 2001 election, the horrific Tampa Children Overboard, SHEVs, We'll Decide Who Comes to This Country, was when we really had to step up to the plate. And I think it's something that as an organisation we can be quite proud of, that we have continued as a social movement for these 2 decades and risen to the challenges, and imagine how much worse it would be if it wasn't for organisations like ours and all the others in the refugee space who fought to change the system here. So Tilly, welcome. Oh, sorry, one thing. I'm very sorry about that. I keep forgetting to say this because I get too excited. But people who are on Zoom, you will be able to type in questions. Dan here, who's monitoring the Zoom, will relay those questions. It's a bit difficult with the hybrid to have, you know, verbal contributions over Zoom as well as here, but we will be having a discussion for the people who are here face to face.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, thanks to our other speakers. Thanks, Zaki, and thank you, Behrouz. Yeah, definitely. As Mark said, I've been involved for a few years, but nowhere near as many years as a lot of the people in this room, and certainly the other speakers here tonight through their sort of experience in this area. And I want to acknowledge as well, like I became a refugee activist because of, you know, seeing what was going down on Manus and the campaign there, and the refugees themselves, you know, fighting for their freedom. So I think it's important that when we hear people's stories, we don't just sit and listen, but we use that to sort of drive our own activism and to get involved. So I was just going to talk tonight about our approach as RAC to elections, this topic of scaremongering and scapegoats and survivors. Because I think we have a particular approach to elections in RAC. You know, I'm not going to sort of give a talk as a how to vote scorecard. I don't have time to go into all the policy differences between Labor and Liberal and the Greens, so I'm not going to focus on that. And it's not really our focus as RAC, you know. Of course, we absolutely want people to support refugees at the ballot box. But we also think that what actually really shapes and drives refugee policy is a broad campaign of protest, of solidarity, that refuses to go quiet regardless of who's in government. And in order to think about how we build that campaign, I think we should talk about some of the rhetoric that we've seen from the major parties this election cycle, as Mark's alluded to in the intro there, and how we can counter that. So we should have a look at, what promises Labor's made, because it's important to keep those in mind to shape the campaign and where we go to, particularly if there is a change in government. Because that's our task as refugee supporters and activists in this room. I think we need to continue to build a movement that any government, Labor or Liberal, can't ignore. So just to start, I think, we've all come to expect, as Behrouz talked about, that in every election, the Liberals will always manage to find a scapegoat for people's fears and frustrations. And for so many election cycles, refugees have unfortunately been that scapegoat. And, this year we've got cost of living surging, we've got wages stagnant, and a lot of people facing pretty dire economic circumstances. So I think a lot of us have been sort of bracing ourselves and waiting to see how bad it's going to get with how badly refugees are going to be scapegoated this time. But as people have said, it hasn't been as big a focus in the way that it has been in previous election cycles. Other than the sort of notable exceptions. So one of those moments was a couple of weeks ago with Albanese reiterating Labor's bipartisan support for turning back boats. And in doing so, he sort of accidentally implied that boat turnbacks meant you didn't need offshore detention, which is a pretty perverse implication in the first place, that by turning people away to languish with no hope of some mythical orderly resettlement process, that you then don't have to worry about them languishing in Australia's offshore detention camps. And we then saw Dutton leap at the opportunity to then attack Albanese on this and talk about how people smugglers would be jumping for joy at the suggestion of ending offshore detention. So Albo, of course, backtracked and clarified, no, Labor still supports both offshore detention and both turnbacks. So pretty shameful rhetoric that we've seen in those moments. We also had, Christina Keneally accusing Morrison of trying to manufacture a difference between with Labor policy when none exists, reiterating that Labor supports Operation Sovereign Borders, and that if you try to come to Australia by boat, you will not make it. You will be turned back or sent offshore. That's a quote from Keneally. And I think, it's fair to say it's a consistent response from Labor with what we've seen in previous years, doing their absolute best not to distinguish themselves from the Liberals on the issue of refugees, and trying to keep the whole refugee issue hushed. But of course, there are significant differences with Labor that people have talked about here tonight, and that's it's important that we actually do talk about the fact that Labor has promised to release the remaining Medevac refugees from detention and, converting SHEVs and temporary protection visas into permanent visas. We welcome these changes. And if a Labor government's elected, and they do deliver on that promise, I think all of us in this room tonight will celebrate with the refugees who are finally free of those horrible conditions that the desperation and uncertainty of life on a temporary visa. So it's good that Labor supports that, but it's not something that they're particularly loud about at the moment. Dutton has already attacked them on it, saying that temporary protection visas underpin the whole Operation Sovereign Borders. So I think in summary of this, the position from Labor, I think it's all around this long-held idea that compassion towards refugees is electoral poison. And as RAC, we oppose that idea quite firmly. It's certainly been true that the scapegoating against refugees has worked on sections of the electorate in the past. But the way that we as the refugee campaign can turn the tide on that is by countering the scapegoating head on, being very clear that the interests of ordinary people are not at odds with offering safety to refugees. And because of, people like the staunch fighters speaking alongside me tonight and countless other refugees and non-refugees through sort of consistent and unrelenting campaigns, we have seen the tide turning, as Behrouz talked about. The Liberal Party continues, of course, to be as cruel and despicable as ever, but they are vulnerable on this issue. The Djokovic incident was an embarrassment for them on the world stage. You know, widespread condemnation of them keeping Medevac refugees in detention hotels after 9 years of detention, and we saw them quietly sort of releasing people just in time for the election. We saw them finally accept the New Zealand deal, which has been on the table since 2013. Now RAC doesn't really see the New Zealand deal as a win. We've been critical of it because, like many of the other issues that people brought up tonight that Behrouz talked about, the problems with not accepting people in Port Moresby, also the fact that it's not enough people, 500 isn't enough. But also it maintains the fact that Australia can't just bring people here and let them stay, and that we have to find somewhere else to send people. So I don't think we would throw our support behind the New Zealand deal, but we do see it as certainly a turnaround in Liberal policy, and quite a telling one. We've also seen, you know, Morrison, as people have said, feel like he has to say something about Afghan visas. We've had, you know, this groundswell of public support for offering protection to Afghans, and, you know, this incredible rally that Zaki built, the community pulling together, and Australian society as a whole very clearly being in support of bringing refugees from Afghanistan. And Morrison feeling like he had to respond to that with an announcement of extra intakes of Afghan refugees, even though it wasn't actually an extra intake, but you can see that they're feeling the heat. And of course, the issue of the Medevac family from Biloela, that's not going away. There's incredibly widespread support for them, so much so that Labor is now vocally supportive of allowing them to return home to Biloela. So I think it's really clear in all these issues that refugees are not electoral poison. You know, it's not that people in this country are just hopelessly racist and that's that. No, you actually you can build a campaign that unmasks the scapegoating for exactly what it is. So I think it's the job of refugee activists in the lead up to this election to make the refugee issue political poison for the Liberals for their cruelty, because people can see through it. As Behrouz talked about, people can see that all that money spent on offshore detention, that's not money that's helping me and my wages to go up and my cost of living to get easier. So just to quickly look ahead to after the election, I think we can have a lot to discuss tonight about after the election, because that's kind of why we put on this forum tonight, was to say that the campaign is going to need to continue well after the election, regardless of who's in government. I think, yeah, we've got a bigger job than the campaign in the next couple of weeks. We have the whole logic of Operation Sovereign Borders to contend with, regardless of who wins. If the Liberals do win, which, as you know, people have said, we don't like to think about it. It's a pretty horrible prospect, particularly for refugees who are so affected by that in such a particular way. But we've had wins under the Liberals before from a strong campaign. The kids came off Nauru under the Liberals. So a Liberal government, the vote is not the be all and end all. With a strong campaign, we can actually build a movement that can fight for refugees under the Liberals as well. And if Labor does take office and if they abolish temporary protection visas, the refugee campaign will need to counter this glaring contradiction in their policy that they say they don't want to keep people in limbo on temporary visas, so they're for abolishing TPVs and SHEVs, but there are still over 1,100 refugees from the Medevac legislation, from the kids off Nauru, who are, you know, on bridging visas, that the most insecure class of visa, who have to get their visas renewed, you know, every 6 months. So if Labor's against keeping people in limbo, they cannot maintain this line that those refugees can never resettle in Australia. So we of course need to counter that. We need to fight to dismantle offshore detention entirely, to counter the New Zealand deal and just the idea of third country solutions. We should be clearer than ever that the message of the refugee campaign is bring them here and let them stay. And we need to put pressure to bring more people here. We need an immediate special intake of 20,000 Afghan refugees over and above the annual sort of normal humanitarian intake, not just the status quo as Morrison tried to spin as an announcement. We also need to push back against the government ban on accepting refugees from Indonesia, which is as an instrumental part of Operation Sovereign Borders. There's 14,000 refugees in Indonesia awaiting resettlement, and 7,000 of those are Afghans. So it's a big task that remains ahead for the campaign, but the tide is shifting. They haven't been able to use it as a scapegoating issue in the same way this election as they have in past. So I think what's going to win those changes is the same thing that's gotten us to where we are now, which is consistent demonstrations, consistent public pressure, organising and resisting. And there's no better example of that resistance than people beside me and Behrouz on Zoom. And many others in the room tonight as well. So I look forward to hearing from other people in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tilly. And just on that note, before I open it up to contributions and questions from the floor here, and read out some questions that have already come in on the Zoom, there's two different bits of paper on the tables there on the side of the room. One is, in the lead up to the election and on election day, how to vote refugee. It's a bit of a scorecard of the main different aspects of refugee policy, comparing the Greens, Labor and the Coalition. And of course, the Coalition have crosses next to everything. Labor, a few ticks, Greens, mostly ticks. So yeah, that one is worth taking, maybe a few copies to people. There's also something that we've written, which kind of Tilly has touched on many of the points in this document that a few people from RAC produced over the last little while. Why we need to keep fighting for refugees after the election, regardless of who wins. Going over a lot of those things that all our speakers have really talked about, the limitations, the New Zealand deal, Operation Sovereign Borders, the situation in Afghanistan, the situation in Indonesia. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little bit more in summing up. So please grab that as well. I'd also just like, as I said, we've been around for 20 years, and I just noticed walk in an ex-student of mine from maybe almost 20 years ago at Chatswood Intensive English Centre, Bahram, who came from Afghanistan in the early 2000s. So yeah, I'm sure Zaki would like to talk to you as well at the end, as well as me, of course. But I'm going to now open it up for questions, comments. For people in the room, I think for the benefit of people who are on Zoom, it would be great to come up here to the mic so people can see you on the camera. So yes, you first. Sorry, your name?
Irfan.
Okay. Irfan, come up, Irfan.
Okay. All right. So my name's Irfan. I'm from True Crime News Weekly. We're a website that is covering the election. I'm just curious as to find out whether I notice in the refugee movement there's a predominant presence of people from one side of the political spectrum, as well as a reluctance to criticise the ALP for their what is clearly a virtually identical policy, if not some even more draconian measures that they introduced, particularly during the Gillard and Rudd years. I also note that there are people in the Conservative side who actually are very supportive of refugees. And in particular, I would suggest that you watch a YouTube video which shows PJ O'Rourke, the late PJ O'Rourke, talking on Q&A about asylum seekers and saying, let them in, they're assets, I believe in immigration, and we're, Conservatives are getting it wrong about immigration. I'm just wondering what steps can be taken to get more friends on both sides of the debate so that the refugee issue doesn't just become a partisan issue.
Thank you, Irfan. I will keep a speaking list. If, James, you've got your hand up. And maybe after James, Dan might read out some of the questions that have come up on the chat.
I think it's right, like all the speakers said, that we absolutely want to see the back of the Morrison government, and I think it'll be encouraging if people, do kick them out at the election. But I think that's, not least in terms of what people have said about the refugees, what it will mean in terms of people who are on temporary visas in the community. I think Behrouz was quite right that a lot of the focus of the media reporting over the last, 10 years, 20 years perhaps even, about refugees has been on detention, and the issue of refugees who are living in the community hasn't got as high a profile. And I think it's important to make that point about the kind of torture those people experience, and that there needs to be significant change over that, because I think it also points towards, if Labor is elected, the kind of issues that we are going to have to take up, which also are much more about people in the community, although it's not going to be that cohort on SHEVs and TPVs, but people who've been on Addis and Nauru in one way, shape or form. I think in terms of the New Zealand deal, I think it's also worth reiterating that you've got 450 places. That's over 3 years. So you're already going to have on the 19th of July, people have been waiting 9 years for resettlement and haven't got it. Living now in Australia, and some of them are going to be told they have to wait another 3 years before they can get to New Zealand. That's just ridiculous that people have to wait that long. And in addition, as Tilly said, we know there's going to be 500 or so left over even after those 3 years are finished in terms of New Zealand. So I think that's going to be a big issue that will be there, no matter kind of who wins the election, even if Labor is kind of elected. And it is the unfinished business of offshore detention in terms of people who are already here in Australia. Most of the people on Nauru, at least, will probably get to New Zealand as part of that deal if they're not already going to the US or Canada. But there is going to be a big issue about people who were sent to offshore, who are in Australia, who are still in limbo, potentially for years and years more. And I think in terms of trying to make that issue a bit more public, we can point to what it means is the people who've been in the Park Hotel where there's been continuous protests, people like Moz, people like Farhad, who have, some profile, a lot of people have got to know out of what's been happening in the Park Hotel. Those people are, some of them and people like them are potentially waiting another 3 years or have no, actual, route to resettlement and to a permanent future. So I think that's going to be a big issue we have to continue to kind of fight around after the election, that people may not be in detention, but they absolutely are still in limbo. They still are facing torture, and they still need us to, campaign with them and to fight with them to actually get, a permanent resettlement and a decent future.
Did you want to? Yeah, you go.
Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail. Again, less of a question, more of a comment, but I think it's really important that when we're talking, not to sort of abstract away from what we were even talking about, but I think it's important when we talk about refugees and sort of the way we treat refugees currently, is sort of exploring that in the context of the effects of climate change and the effects that climate change is going to have on our political system. We already live in a country where refugees are really horrifically mistreated and maybe kept in offshore detention camps. And how do we think that's going to look in 50 years when there's 100 million people being displaced from various people around the world, needing resettlement, needing assistance from other countries. And I think as I think Perez said, the refugee policies we have currently are they are really horrifically affecting the sort of state of racism and discourse in this country. And I think it's really important that when we are fighting for more humane refugee policies, that we're also thinking about how those are going to be seen in the future. We cannot have the current refugee policies inflicting future brutality onto even more people when there are even more desperate people in need of assistance. That's all I have.
Sorry, this is a bit janky. I'm just going to read out the questions from the online discussion. We've had a few. I'm going to try and get to all of them. We had two contributions from Nico. First was essentially asking, how do we campaign after the election? And that if we're hoping for the ALP victory, it'd be welcome, but we will be betrayed. So it's a general question about how to campaign for the campaign after the election, and that the ALP is not really a body we can trust. The second question was about, and there's actually two questions about this, about the movement of refugees from Mida to Christmas Island. If people knew more about them, if they're currently being supported, why the government is actually doing this right now at the same time that it's posturing is soft on refugee, or posturing is sort of welcome to refugees through the New Zealand deal. What's the kind of politics behind it? The other question was from Jill about protests at Villawood. We've seen a lot of protests in Melbourne and in Brisbane, really demonstrating solidarity with refugees in the hotel system there. Is there potential for more rallies at Villawood to show solidarity and sympathy with them? There's another question from, I only get the abbreviations of the name, so STEP, I'm presuming that's Stephen. Are the priority for the next 2 weeks to get the ALP elected? And the final question was from Glenn. It was essentially about, there's a narrative that the coalition is successful because it has successfully stopped the refugees. The refugee question is no longer an issue in the way it once was, so therefore the Liberals are sort of successful. How do we push against that narrative? What's the best way to do that? So I think that's all the questions from the audience we have. If there are any more come up, but after that we might go to the actual panelists.
People who are here present are welcome to also attempt to answer any of those. Ian.
Yeah, thanks. It was very good to hear from Behrouz from New Zealand, and yeah, Zaki and Tilly as well. I mean, I'm not going to try and answer all the questions. I think in terms of priorities over the next 2 weeks, I think the priority is not to get the Labor elected. The priority is to get Morrison out. Now, the fact is that will mean getting Labor elected, no matter how many Greens or other independents may be elected alongside them. But we need to get rid of Morrison. I don't think there's any question of that. And people here, I know, are already committed to doing what they can over the next 2 weeks to make sure we get rid of Morrison. But I think the big question is what do we do afterwards? And I think in that respect, I think it's worth understanding the scale of the unfinished business. Right? I'm going to look on the optimistic side. I think the chances are we will have a Labor government, but the reality is that except for the TPVs and the SHEVs, nothing is going to change. You know, we've had Christina Keneally and Albanese say they're in favour of the turnbacks, they're in favour of keeping offshore detention. Beirus has reminded us that even with the New Zealand deal, which Labor is committed to, people who are in Papua New Guinea are not part of that. We don't know what's going to happen to people who are asylum seekers and not refugees in Nauru. They're not a part of the New Zealand deal. So I made the point that there's a candidates meeting out at Wentworth the other day. But if you look at the fact that in detention, we've still got Afghan refugees in detention who were failed their refugee application because they were told it was safe to go back to Kabul. Now, it was a nonsense, when that happened. It's trebly, quadruply a nonsense in the circumstances, but they are still in detention. Even having their protection having been rejected on that, on that basis. The fact is that we've got people, Afghans, similarly in the community on bridging visas or on expired bridging visas, technically unlawful, who have been rejected for protection on exactly the same basis. We can talk about the situation in Sri Lanka, but the fact is there are thousands of Tamils who are on expired visas in the community at risk of actually being detained, and being removed. We've got 1,200 people who are on bridging visas, people who are brought from Manus and Nauru to Australia who are on bridging visas, who a Labor government are not going to give permanent protection to. We're going to go through some kind of farce over over 3 years, getting 450 people to New Zealand, people who have made their lives here. Some have been here since 2014, have got kids, have got families, except that they're going to be uprooted and sent to New Zealand rather than extending the permanent protection, not just to the TTVs and the SHEVs, but to all those, all those people who are in the, who are in the community. I think the thing is that we are going to have to push to put refugees back on the agenda. The small target that Albanese has tried to present, around this issue is the kind of thing which just puts the Labor Party in retreat. Right? They're not even talking about re-establishing the Medevac legislation. But the fact is there are sick people on Nauru and in Papua New Guinea who could be brought here under Medevac legislation. But I doubt that we're going to hear about the Labor Party actually re-establishing that, even if there are independents and Greens alongside them who would vote to re-establish the Medevac legislation. If those things are going to happen, the question of the people in detention, the people who are in the community who need permanent protection, if that's going to happen, it's going to require a movement to actually put that on the agenda, not just over the next couple of weeks, but it does mean what happens after the next couple of weeks is going to be as important as it was, if anything happened after 2001, because if we are going to get that, that genuine humanitarian policy, then we need to actually, fight for a situation in which no matter how people come here, if they come here by boat, they're welcomed, they get permanent protection, the possibility of living in the community. So, if people haven't signed up for RAC, make sure you sign up before you go, because our work's going to start after the 21st of May in the same kind of way. The campaign that we've been building over the last 2 decades isn't going to disappear after the 21st of May.
There is a little bit more time if anybody else would like to ask a question or contribute. I just wanted to get some views about my question about the extent to which we can make sure that the refugee issue is not just a partisan issue, it's not seen as a partisan issue. Because that seems to be the perspective that certainly the Murdoch media are pushing and other people pushing that. If you support refugees, you're not feeling that. Which I don't think is necessarily the case. I mean, I am no lefty, but I hear and I understand support refugees. PJ O'Rourke's not lefty, so that's what I'm interested in finding out.
Yeah, look, I'll comment. It's a bit unusual to do this from the chair, but I know that under the Howard government there were some wet liberals. The Petro Georgios and all those who ended up threatening to cross the floor about long-term detention and kids in detention and so on. And there is a stream of thought amongst the sort of libertarian, unfortunately they've got a very bad name for their position around COVID now, but the libertarian free market types who say if we're going to have free market goods moving around the world, then there should be free movement of people. But you don't tend to see that reflected, I think, in the right wing of politics. You get economists saying that kind of stuff and the Economist magazine saying that kind of stuff, but you don't tend to see conservative governments saying that. They're all for the free flow of goods and services, but not for people to be able to move from country to country. So unfortunately...
What I'm saying is there a strategic benefit, or is there some way that the movement can ensure that the issue is not seen as partisan?
I think, unfortunately, the way that the political alignments are is that it is the progressive side of politics. It is the Labor movement, at least at the union level. It is the Greens, it is social justice activists who have been the ones standing up for refugee rights, So I think basically that is the strategic orientation that we have had, that the working class in general, which is the vast majority of Australian population, has no interest in anti-refugee policies, and to try and convince people to break from, the Murdoch press, the Liberal Party, the shock jocks trying to poison their heads. The other question about Villawood, I thought I'd quickly answer. In Kangaroo Point and the Mantra and then the Park Hotel, they were very accessible, and large numbers of the Medevac refugees were there. We used to go to Villawood very, very regularly to protest outside, unfortunately, there are a few times that we had to have vigils. When they built the new Villawood, they made it so that the people inside could never see us. And on a back road that was, inaccessible and all this kind of thing, where the media would never come. So we have tended to, if we're having snap rallies about what's happening in Villawood, to instead go to immigration up here at Central. That doesn't mean to say we're against all rallies to Villawood in the future. I've probably spoken enough. Is there anyone else who has asked a question on Zoom or would like to speak from the audience here? If not, I might just call our three speakers to come back up to answer any of the unanswered questions or add to whatever has been said. So could I have Zaki?
Thank you. I don't have much to add on in response to the questions. I think often, again, the issue gets stigmatized in a different ways. If it's from no matter who, what we keep forgetting is it's about humans and how much damage the policies and the election has done to refugees. Irfan, I think, to respond to my opinion, we do need to reach out to more Australians. We do need to engage a wider society into the conversation. It's not an issue that should be only for leftists. It's a humanitarian crisis, and I think we should get involved in any way possible with wider community. And that could be anyone in Australia. And I'm not trying to make any points here, but what I'm saying is the more platform we have, and when I say platform, it could be individual, the more reach out we have to Australian community. And what I believe is that once the Australian community knows that their neighbor, their friends are in trouble, they will stand up. And I think we should, I'm not proposing any proposal here, but what I'm proposing is we should think more critically, strategically, how we can use the platforms that we have to reach out to a wider community. If we don't have platforms, how can we create one? And if we don't have the resources and capacity, we should open the conversation to other businesses, individuals, invite them into the conversation and make the conversation bigger. The bigger we go, the louder we are, and the more support we have. I know it's critical. I know we'll get attacks from a lot of people who are anti-refugees. But why they're anti-refugees is because they're never exposed to someone. They don't know that they're human, they have families, they're going through crisis. But I personally do believe in human connections and bridges that we need to build. And it takes time. It doesn't happen over the next 2 weeks or in the next year or so. But I do believe if we do build a bridge between humans, if we do build connection, we would have more supportive to the humanitarian crisis, not refugees. And my final point is thank you for being here tonight, and please spread out the messages, and we are hopeful that the election will be beneficial towards refugees. But also I want to amplify a message saying we need to use platforms to send messages out to refugees and to refugee community, saying that no matter who will win the election, we are here for you, we stand with you, and we will keep fighting for what's right. And we'll keep fighting until we have freedom for you, refugees and people seeking asylum. So thank you for your time and being here today and watching us online. Thank you.
Now over to Behrouz for some concluding remarks and answering questions. I think you're still on mute, Behrouz.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to mention something about when I say that how this policy has impacted on political culture in Australia, and why I say that you are not only fighting for refugees, you are fighting for principles and for democratic values and for Australia's future and for the next generation and current generation. If we see, I think that this party has got many lessons from this exile policy and the policies towards refugees. And now in this election, we see that they established a campaign on national security. And we know that they have been torturing people because of national security, what they claim. They say that they established the whole policy on based of national security. And now they say that again, national security, but this time they focus on China. So I mean, it is the same method, same mentality, and that started with refugees. So I believe that anything wrong happen in Australia, first they do it on refugees, because refugees are marginalized, because refugees are dehumanized, and people don't hear them. So that's why I think it's really important that we challenge this mentality, the same mechanism that they always use it to create a fake fear to get votes. And I think that is really important. And one of the questions mentioned about they recently sent refugees to Christmas Island. And I think that shows that we are facing an industry. We have an industry in Australia, and that industry, they spend more than $14 billion on it. And that industry, it means building detention, building prisons, employed officers, medical system, psychologists, and many people who are working in that industry, and many people in the immigration system are working on this industry. So for keeping this industry, what they need is bodies, refugees, you know. That's why for keeping that industry alive, they always need people in indefinite detention. Always they need people in prison. That's why they just play with refugees. And I think there is not guarantee. If Liberal wins again after the election, they go and take those refugees who are already free in the community, who are in that society. It's possible that they take them back to the detention. So that's why it's really important that we understand this mentality, you know, and we fight that. And now we are close to the election. After the election, we can't talk about if Liberal lose the power, if Morrison lose the power. After that, we can't talk about other things. We can't talk about how these policies still exist. You know, we can't talk about this industry. We can't talk about refugees in Indonesia. We can't talk about refugees generally. But for now, I think it is the time to be practical and try and fight in the last days to create a political change. If we don't create political change, I think after the election, they will continue to this, and there is not guarantee for those refugees who already released into the community. And that is possible. This government has shown that they are able to do, and they are capable to do any kind of inhuman policies. And they did that, they have done that, and they will do. You know, we are facing same people. It's possible. So that's why for preventing that, for stopping that, we should get active these days, close to the election, to create a political change. I think that is really important. After that, we can have meeting again, events, and talk about other things. But for now, we should just focus on the election. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again so much, Behrouz and Tilly.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks again to both our speakers, Zaki and Behrouz. Really appreciate you guys giving us your time and for everything you do in the campaign as organisers and activists. Just to take up a couple of little points that came up in the discussion, I would agree with what Zaki said, that it shouldn't be an issue that's just for lefties or those who see themselves as already on the left. And certainly we don't want to have RAC events where, you know, everyone in the room's a Greens member or a socialist and we're sort of checking people at the door for what your politics are. But, you know, I think it's difficult to learn about refugee policy in Australia and overseas, around the world, you know, in the UK, what we've seen in the US, and to not start to veer to the left of politics. I think you'd be hard pressed to maintain right-wing politics as a refugee activist, having seen the cruelty that comes from the right wing of politics internationally. So, you know, I've met plenty of liberals for refugees at events. I've gone to a couple of events where people say, oh yeah, I'm campaigning for better refugee policy in the Liberal Party, and you kind of think, I don't think you'll be a Liberal Party member for very long, because it is the nature of the refugee debate in this country that it has been driven, the scapegoating and the fear mongering has been driven by right-wing governments. So I think as RAC we are, you know, our roots do lie in left-wing ideas like Mark talked about. But having said that, the campaign is a broad church. It's something we've worked quite hard on as RAC as well, is to really try and encourage Labor Party members to encourage the unions to back the refugee campaign, and to see the change from the sort of organisational, like the sort of rusted on Labor as well. So yeah, I wanted to. Just one more thing on that is the Conservatives backing refugees, that when it is often that that economic take on immigration, why immigration's really good, because it brings people to work for society. I don't think that's something we agree with. I think we think that refugees should be brought here because people deserve somewhere safe to live, regardless of how productive they are and how much they contribute to the economy. I think, yeah, we support refugees' right to live wherever they, you know, find safe harbour, regardless of whether they're on Centrelink or they're a CEO or whatever. It's your right to safety. I wanted to take up the point in the chat about this idea that the coalition has been successful. I know you weren't saying that they were successful. I know you're saying that it's this thing that people sometimes think that they look like they've been successful in dealing with this issue because the boats stopped or because people aren't, you know, it's not as present in the media anymore. And maybe politically they've been successful, but I think we have to be very clear that boat turnbacks have created desperation and misery outside of our field of vision and shipped that elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind. And there is absolutely no orderly queue that people can get in to be resettled and to find a safe place to live as a refugee. It's not, there isn't an orderly system. It's chaos internationally, and boat turnbacks actually just shift the problem off Australia's hands. One more thing from the chat is someone said, you know, Labor will betray and disappoint us. Another person said, oh, maybe Labor's playing it safe, you know, maybe they're just trying to not be wedged on this during the electoral campaign. I think as the refugee campaigners RAC, at least, we don't have illusions that everything is going to be rosy under a Labor government. As many people have said, we're going to have a fight continuously on our hands, because they have reiterated that support for Operation Sovereign Borders. So yeah, like all the issues we've discussed tonight, it's a fight that's going to continue to happen, but it's not a fight for votes. It's a fight that actually is for building the campaign consistently, regardless of whether we're in an election cycle, for building that public awareness and building the solidarity right through, as we have for the last few decades. Yeah, so on that note, I don't know if Mark's going to talk about this, but I know that we have already sort of penciled in a date for a rally after the election. It'll be in July. So we've already got that on our calendar, and I hope to see every single person in this room on the streets with our banners, regardless of who's in government. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tilly. Big thanks to you, and also really honoured to have had both Zaki and Beirus speaking tonight. So give them all a round of applause again. Look, I really just want to reiterate the importance of the refugee campaign going forward. Other people have said there's so much unfinished business that's going to happen. I do hope that Morrison only has 13 days left or 12 days left as Prime Minister, and that he can be consigned to the dustbin of history, and I can finally change my profile photo on Facebook of yelling at Morrison. But we know that you know, even the things that Labor's promised, like getting rid of the TBVs and SHEVs, they're going to have to be pushed to act on that quickly. You know, they'll probably bring the Billawheeler family back quickly, because that's very politically palatable. But the stuff about TB and SHEVs, we're going to have to push them to do it quickly and to make it permanent. We're going to have to also raise, you know, the other unfinished business, like all the people that Beirus talked about who are still in PNG, the people, the over 1,000 people who are here, either brought out before Medevac or during Medevac, who don't have any right to apply for any kind of visa or anything like that. And I think that raises the demonstration that we've already started planning for the 24th of July, which is the Sunday after the 9th anniversary it's going to be. The 9th anniversary of the 19th of July 2013, when Kevin Rudd made that statement that no one who arrives after this date will get permanent protection. That is still bipartisan policy. And I think we have to draw on the contradiction in Labor where they say those who arrived prior to July 2013 on TBVs and SHEVs, we will give you permanent protection. Those who arrived after that date, not only will we won't even give you temporary protection, we won't even allow you to get any kind of protection claim in Australia. And I think that day, is a day where we have to prise open that contradiction. And also, of course, all those people, and I've been to Indonesia a couple of times, all those people who are there stranded for over a decade now, who have no hope of resettlement. The UNHCR is basically saying to them, there's no hope of you getting resettled because the Western world is too stingy. We have to break that freeze and put the pressure on. And that's a big reason why we want Labor in. They are more susceptible to our pressure from the campaign, from the trade union movement, from the rest of them. And I think the bigger the margin, the better. The bigger the margin, the less excuse they have to give us their weasel words and their excuses and all the rest of it. And as Beirus said, yes, of course, our efforts go towards throwing out Morrison in the next 2 weeks, but clearly we have a lot more to do afterwards. So again, thank you for everybody who's here. Thank you everybody who's on Zoom, whether you're in Sydney, interstate or overseas. Thank you again, everybody, for being here.